we are now moving to Portugal. And I asked Tiago Macena to join us. Portugal is a treasure trove of old vines and of incredible diversity. And they are starting to put together collective programs. They started with the research. The Porvid program in Portugal has really been a model for grapevine research and varietal research. Tiago, I brought in because he's a winemaker who's worked for big wineries and is now working on very niche projects, adding a lot of value, working with wineries in Dão and Alentejo, recuperating old vines, and also encouraging the restoration of traditional practices. So, for example, he works with the Talha, which is the sort of the amphora, if you like, of the Alentejo.
Hello, Tiago.
Hi.
Great to chat.
Yes.
I've got so many questions. Portugal is a wine country that I love and that I've visited many, many times.
I know.
And I think the last time I was there, I ended up in Porto Alegre. I was doing some winemaking down. No, it was the time before last. I was doing some winemaking down in Vidigueira, and we went to see some old vineyards in Porto Alegre, and they were very old, and they were mixed plantings, and they were in terrible condition. So what can you do when you find an old vineyard that's in bad condition? What would your approach be? Would you assess whether it's got the potential to be great first, or would you give it the benefit of the doubt and start farming it and recuperating?
I can give you my example. I'm being glad, and maybe I just jump onto it, and I believe that will go all right. And I can give you as the example in Alentejo back in 2017 when we started to work in that winery, Adega Amarel. One of the first things, or when we stepped on the vineyard and we stepped on the oldest plot, these are some pictures from there. The challenge from the owner was, okay, I heard that we have some support to pull out these old vineyards and plant some new, and we can get some money from it. And the first thing that I said was, please let me give it a go for 1 year or two to prove that they have special value. And at the moment we have 3 years in a row, and the wine is constantly showing well. And it's showing well because we started to pay attention. They were abandoned for some time because they were not part of the company. The company started in 2017. But it was a hard decision, was a feeling, and it turned out to be okay. Of course, old vineyard is not synonym of fine vines, and sometimes we need to work on the field with the approach that Marco bring, or with some common sense, like keeping better the soil or giving some work or pruning it better. And I do believe, as Marco said as well, that the vineyard is a self-regulated plant. So if we treat her better, then it will come back to us with better fruit or more consistently produced, and that helps to show in the final product.
So what's your stepping back a little bit, what's your background in Portugal? Which regions have you worked in, and what's your overall view of the vineyards?
All right, so I started to work back in 2007, and then I started in the Dão, where I'm based at the moment, still in probably one of the biggest companies that they had some wineries in Dão, but also some wineries in other regions as Douro and Bairrada. And my first contact with an old vineyard was in 2007 in the Douro Valley, and it was a very easy decision because we knew that from that old plot in the mid of the slope, that would be the source of part of our grapes for the single vintage, sorry. And then from there I went to Bairrada, and I worked in the biggest co-op. And yesterday some people were talking about the role of the co-ops in maintaining these old vineyards. And back in Cantanhede, there are a strong rewarding of the older plots, because they have a lot of cooperants. They have 1,000 hectares of land, and in between those that land, we have a lot of jams, and back since 15, the cooperative started to pay differently that sort of grapes, and that happens the same in, for instance, in the cooperative of Amareleja down in Alentejo, where they started to pay differently. But unfortunately, that's not a common trace, and there are cooperatives that do not value those sort of grapes, and that's an opportunity for smaller producers such as the ones that I work with, and that gives us the opportunity to step in and coming back to your first question, and first moving it with the heart, and then started to work the land and started to put some work in the vineyard and take it back from the grapes.
In Portugal, one of the things that struck me early on when I first visited was how there's a less of an emphasis on the variety. Mm-hmm. And part of that stems from the fact that the best vineyards in the Douro are blends, mixtures of maybe 30, 40 different varieties interplanted. And I remember going to one vineyard, and they'd been doing research, and they discovered that with proper ampelography using DNA and everything, that or microsatellites, sorry, that they'd got varieties in there that weren't known, yes. And so that's the I think that was Maria Teresa.
Exactly. Yeah. I will give you that example. Maria Teresa, they report 54 grapes. For instance, this morning when I was preparing for this conference, I didn't want just to talk about the places where I work. I spoke with a colleague from the DOC Trás-os-Montes. Trás-os-Montes is on the northern part of the country, right here. And they are working, and they have a lot of old vineyards, and they identified 40 different varieties in one of their locations. I think that a common trace to all of the Portuguese vineyards is the field blend, is the mixed plantation. You have exceptions to this rule. You have, for instance, nearby Lisbon, south of Lisbon, in Setúbal, you have all the vineyards of Castelao. In Bairrada, for instance, you have the major part is Baga, but then also, for instance, when I spoke with Luís Pato, who, by side note, sends you his regards, has 95% of Baga, and then the rest 5% will be white grapes. And there's an historical reason for this mixed plantation, because they were almost worked like an insurance policy, because some grapes, as you all know, they start to the cycle earlier, so others start late. So in a way, they were a way to avoid to lose all of the production to ale or to frozen or to any extreme climatic event. And that happens the same in the harvest time. Some are earlier ripe and some are not. And from the blend, which is somehow a common trace to all of the Portuguese wines, not just the old vineyards, the blend is part of the essence of this wine country. And so all of the old vineyards are mixed plantations of different varieties, normally just reds or some whites in the middle, like happens in the Dow. And that's somehow an identity, and that steps differently from what we heard yesterday from Elias, that he just works with Irene, or even the example from South Africa with Chenin Blanc. So in Portugal, the thing is the field blend, is the mixed plantation.
I think one of the things that's really helped Portugal stay Portuguese is the degree of isolation, relative isolation that it's experienced, and that it hasn't made some of the viticultural disasters that lots of other countries did in the 60s and 70s, And in some ways, that's the beauty of Portuguese wine, is that now, yes, for a long time, the wines, when I first started coming to Portugal in the 90s, there were a lot of shocking wines, there was some really, really unpleasant things happening. There was one that provided a lot of the supermarket wine in the UK. I won't mention their name, but they had this strange thing happening in the winery, and they did all sorts of bizarre things. And the result was just, was appalling. It was just, all the wines tasted the same, whatever region they came from. Anyway, I'm digressing, but I think that since then there's been a real revolution. And I know that and what's fascinating is the dynamism. So you've got this wonderful heritage, but the people championing the wonderful heritage tend to be the dynamic people, the people who are, and not just young dynamic people, sometimes the older dynamic people as well. It's just the ones who are really wanting to go and tell the world about Portuguese wines and want to farm the right way. They want to make wines the right way. And I think that's been really exciting to watch.
And that's the fact that you mentioned that it's the isolation. It was the isolation that kept the old vineyards back in Malaysia, where I work in Alentejo. It was probably the last piece of land in Alentejo that received some funding from the European Union to replant, to rebuild, to reestablish the vineyards. And it happened, and the cooperative once again has a major role, because in between 97 up to 2007, it was almost a depressive moment. And from what I spoke with my friend and colleague, he's the winemaker from the cooperative, he said it was almost stagnant. And it was then that with the first funding, then they started to replant. And it was this delayed factor that granted that at the moment in Malaysia you have a lot of old vineyards. And it happens the same in Trás-os-Montes, in Beira Interior. Some of the older plots in the Down, for instance, it's hard to start to make a correlation, but are in one of the subregions or tend to be in the sides of the region. So because they were the latest to receive those sort of funding that helped to as Dan was saying, to get a faster return on investment. So if you get a larger yield, if you put the wine in the market sooner, then you get your money back sooner than later. And that was part of the thinking process. Of course, there's a new and not so new generation of people that are trying to sell and to show and to explain the differences. And maybe the fact that old wines are a blend is easier to explain than to try to name any of the 54 grapes that Maria Teresa has, or any of the 5 or 10 grapes that we have in these older plots that I work with. So maybe the fact that field blend or old vineyard is easily, it's much easier to explain than to try to name Tinta Francisca, Bag, Coração de Galo, and so on.
Yeah, I think field blend as a sort of a name to describe old vines is quite a nice one, because it just sounds good. Old vines does sound good, but maybe to most people who aren't wine people, old vines maybe doesn't have the same ring. But I think what the low-hanging fruit here would be to scout for old vineyards on good soils in less fashionable regions. So you mentioned the Beira Interior.
Yeah.
There's some fantastic vineyards there, I'm sure. There must be some really good ones, and presumably that they're not expensive, because the wines don't get much money. And you said Trás-os-Montes, which would be interesting as well. I think there must be some, I mean, you know, because you've traveled around, but there must be some fantastic old vines that have the potential to make wines with personality that could be sold at decent prices, which currently aren't being utilized that way.
Yeah, true. Because, for instance, in where I work in the Dow, we got to rent a vineyard. It was not that expensive, because the way was all going to the cooperative, being paid as one of the categories that is less well paid, which is mixed blend, because they don't value it. And it's not that expensive. And once again, I spoke with another colleague from Bairrada, and he told me that it's almost a strange number. He's getting, he's buying land. This project is Luís Gomes. He's a neighbor of Luís Pato, and he's buying land for very cheap price per square meter, because people don't want to have the trouble to work the vineyard, because these vineyards are a bit more labor demanding. They require more work. They require more specialization. For instance, in the case of Dow, the plant density of these older plots is 6,500 plants versus the 3,300 something that you can put a tractor on, and that helps to work the vineyard. So yes, there are a lot of undiscovered gems. Luckily enough, in the region, in Dow and in the other regions, we do have a lot of newcomers and new projects. So we can name Passarella, Antonio Madeira, and a few others that are working really well. The people that came in from the Douro, the Mob, And so that shows some dynamism, and that helps to show the world that Down and the other regions have very good grape resources that really need to be explained. But if well vinified, and when I say well vinified, just take care of it. Just don't spoil it with something that juice does not need, and then go put when we can put the bottles in your luggage and travel and show and explain the difference.
Because I guess part of the maintaining this old wine heritage is a social issue as well. If you think of the Douro, you can't mechanize those old vineyards. You need people who are living there, working them. Exactly. And there needs to be a value of actually working with agriculture needs to be seen not as a low-paid profession for old people, or it needs to be something that young people are attracted to actually farming and creating rural communities that then support all forms of agriculture. And I guess in the Alentejo, you have mixed agriculture quite a lot, but then also the vineyards as well. I think that having those thriving rural communities goes hand in hand with people valuing the vineyards.
Exactly. That's a key point. It's bringing value back to the grower. Is bringing value back to the farmer, and taking the example of the Douro as one of the most well-known regions in the country. They took the leadership, and last December they regulated the term old vineyard, in Portuguese, vinha velha, and they were the first ones in the country to do it. So at the moment, to use the term vinha velha, old vineyard, in the Douro, they require the age, they require plant density, they require the field blend, they require the minimum quality that needs to be assessed by the IVDP, the ruling body of the region. And that is all related to giving back the value to keep the people in the land. And that's why it is important that cooperatives that can do it or know that that's a strong bet, that sort of heritage, that sort of all the plots of Baga, that sort of all the plots of Moreto, that's better paid, so they keep on treating them, and we do not lose such grapes, such vineyards. And it happens the same in the region, it happens the same in Trás-os-Montes. There's a lot of activity in terms of newcomers or some isolated winemakers that go there, do a batch and to value and to show the difference. And that's part of the identity, not to be afraid to show a red wine with a paler color, or to show a white wine with a bit more of texture, or a bit more of complexity.
Yeah. So Tiago, I think Sarah's got some questions that she's been gathering, so I'll just pass over to her.
Okay, let's go.
I have, thank you. Tiago, there's a lot of interest on this new designation for the Douro. Okay. Yesterday, actually, we had a really great presentation from Andre Morgenthal and Rosa Kruger of the South African Old Vine Project.
Yes.
And I asked them to come on because I think they're really the benchmark for not only certifying vineyards, but then also linking it to the market. And so we've had several questions asking for more information on that regulation that's been brought in for the Douro. And I wondered if you could tell us, do you know what the plans are for it? So they're certifying the vineyards. Are there plans to then market the wines or do some market research on the wines like the South Africans have done?
Okay. So the Douro, as I told you, the regulation is very recent. It's from last December. Actually, I downloaded the communication. It's from the 22nd of December. So it's almost 3 months now. Oh, it's 3 months. And they regulated it requires 40 years of age, and it requires a field blend, at least 4 grapes in minimum. They required a tasting, that the tasting panel of the Institute reaches a minimum quality. And they also regulated the plant density. From what I spoke with a couple of friends that work in the Douro, the first project was a bit more ambitious. The first project started in 2018, and they wanted to to have a strict regulation on the plant density. They wanted to have the stone terraces, because those stone terraces keep better the erosion and avoid it better than the newer patamares. But they will, from last December, they regulate the term Vinha Velha. And so, as you all know, Douro has a very good characterization of the vineyards, because due to the port production, all of the vineyards are classified for the port. But by that, you have a very intrinsic knowledge of where are the oldest plots, where are the better places. And so I do believe that Douro has that characterization and has regulated the term. But in my personal opinion, we would need something bigger, being national or international, and then each region could fine-tune the details that would find better adapted to apply and to regulate, to respond to the market.
Yes. So I think this is the key. What we need is like almost like a fellowship
Exactly.
of shared values all around the world. On the Old Vines website, actually, we do have links to collective organizations, and there are examples everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So there's Vinho in Chile,
Yes.
There's the Barossa, the Old Vine Charter, the South African Old Vine Project, of course, which I think is probably the most famous and well established. And it's taken them years. So, and of course we have the Lodi Save the Old campaign and the Heritage Vineyards Society in California. And what's really fascinating to me is all of them have a slightly different model.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fine. They all have slightly different definitions on what old vine is. And I think we have to go with that, because we can't let ourselves be snagged by too much detail. As long as the authentic values are there and we are actually lobbying and making structural changes and economic changes to make these vineyards viable at the same time as making old vine mean something beautiful and full of heritage, yes, and value for consumers, everything else will come. I mean, it takes 50 years really to establish like an appellation reputation.
Yes.
You know, if we can get to a global collective within 10 years, that will be good going. And so that's really our mission, and that's really why we founded this nonprofit. Is there more information on the Old Vine Douro project online? I've had a look on their website. Do you know whether they're planning to do a launch or?
I don't know, to be honest. I don't know. The information that I collected was in Portuguese, which for the main, the majority of the audience is not helpful. But I do believe that they will probably prepare something in English to be consulted.
Yeah. And
in the end, as you said, the most important is that the first step was taken, and within the region and within this conference today and yesterday, is that we can move forward from here and regulate and protect, especially so the consumer is very clear about what to expect from such a wine, and not to overuse the term like some people. Sometimes we see it without any meaning.
Exactly, and that's we found that was a very important part of some research we did, the qualitative consumer research. Question from Annie Wexler, who says, do you have any knowledge whether consumers in Portugal are happy to pay more for old vine wines?
No, I don't, but I can tell you that Wines of Portugal are preparing a presentation, because it was requested by a restaurant organization, a cooperative or representative of restaurants that were being somehow very confused with the term Vinha Velha, old vine, and because they were being offered a lot of different old vine and different prices, which is strange, because somehow we could have a minimum price, like a regulation or an expectation. But no, I don't know if the consumer is available for that. I do believe it is somehow, but I don't have data for that regarding the Portuguese market.
Yeah, I know. And it's this kind of lack of data. I mean, all of this will be an ongoing process. I know Andre Morgenthal actually just reminded me, they in South Africa did conduct research with the marketing department, the marketing faculty, and they were able to show, marketing faculty of the university, and they were able to show actually that having their certified heritage vineyard seal on a bottle increased the willingness of the consumer to pay more.
The seal
So
adoption, yes.